Wolf, I'm the president of the museum. Thank you for coming. Hope you enjoy the program. Upcoming programs. Next Wednesday we have Abigail.
We have Chad McCain, who's going to do a presentation on Missouri's cave systems. He's actually been here once before to talk about the Black Fathom cave system, so he's coming back to do a new update on other things they've been exploring.
And the following week?
And then the following week, again, Wednesday at 7 p.m., we have Gerald Bader, who is going to be doing a presentation on the historic surveying in St. Genevieve.
And then on April 21st?
On April 21st.
See if she studied for this.
On April 21st, we actually are having a fundraiser dinner. It's going to be Jurassic Mystery Theater at the Oris. So it's a ticketed event, but you get dinner, you get a show, we will have a silent auction, a raffle, 50-50. And it should be a lot of fun. We'll have a dinosaur skull there for photo ops. And then we'll be doing a mystery dinner theater type event so that you get to have some fun and help raise money for the museum.
How about May 13th?
On May 10th, we have another presentation.
Anything to derail them, right, Charlie? One more event.
And then on April 29th, which is the following week, we'll have it's a Bruce Stinchcomb Appreciation Day here at the museum in this room. Bruce Stinchcomb is a famous geologist and paleontologist. He's the gentleman who really inspired our curator, Guy Darrow. And so a lot of what you see out in this museum, all of the fossils and the geological specimens, the rocks, a lot of that came about because Bruce Stinchcomb inspired Guy Darrow to collect everything. And Bruce is also the gentleman who originally purchased the land where the big dinosaur was found. He purchased it knowing it was the dig site, so he helped protect that dig site for educational purposes. So we'll be having a day just of appreciation for him. He'll be doing a speech about kind of what inspired him, and we'll have a panel discussion with him and some other scientists. And that's on April 29th.
And since that time, Bruce Stinchcomb has now donated that ground, about 65 acres, to the museum. So we now have that ground. It's a very nice site, and in the future there will be tours to the dig site, and you can actually go and see where they're unearthing the dinosaur right here in Missouri. So the final announcement by Abigail is what you can do if you are not a member of the museum at this time. Special for the day.
Right, so since you came in today and presumably paid money to get in here, if you would like to purchase an annual membership for the museum today, our annual membership costs $60 or it's $5 a month. You can do a recurring membership like that. If you'd like to purchase an annual membership today, you'll get $10 off, so you'll get your price of admission taken off the cost of the membership. And we do have these types of presentations and speaker events at least once, if not twice a month. So there's plenty to look forward to. As I just mentioned, a lot of them.
So if they got an annual membership, they can come in as many times as they would want. Or if they got Rugrats, they can do...
We have a family membership, and that way you can bring in any number of children under 12 and 2 adults. So you can bring your grandkids and your cousins and whoever.
Advertisement is over. Okay, I want to introduce to you our guest speaker today, Mr. Charlie Duckworth, and tell you how he got infected with the bug. So Charlie Duckworth graduated from Fort Hays University in 1973 and started with the Missouri Pacific Railroad, acronym of MOPAC, in 1974. Retiring from Union Pacific after 38 years, having held several management positions in IT, operating, and marketing departments. Him and his wife Linda live in Omaha, Nebraska, and have been married for 44 years. They have 3 grown children, Annie, Emily, and Colin, and 6 grandchildren. Which one lives close by, Charlie?
Little guy sitting in the back.
Yeah. Festus there?
No, they're in Glendale.
Glendale, okay. His father worked for the MOPAC, so the family had a pass and frequently rode the Eagle passenger trains for free. These trips probably sowed the seeds for Charlie's interest in the Missouri Pacific and its history. Charlie is a life member of the Missouri Pacific Historical Society and has served as its president on several occasions and on its board as a director for several years. He has had several published articles on railroad history over the years, with this book here, this one here being your third, right?
Third one is the one I just showed you this morning. So this one I just came out with. So I'd ask people, you know, when they bought this one, did you read it? And they'd say, no, I looked at the pictures. So the next book I did was a picture book. And it's got a lot of information in it, but it's not near the thick history that the one is.
You're up, Charlie. I don't have anything else. You didn't write that?
That's it?
Yeah.
Okay. See if this thing works. Okay, anybody recognize? That's my favorite picture of all the shots we picked out. It's over at Bonterre, obviously. You got a little 04 switch here, and they called these bobber cabooses. These were real unusual. They just had 4-wheel trucks under them instead of 6-wheel trucks. And probably because it, you know, gave them short room to switch with. You didn't have a big old long caboose dealing with. They outlawed them in the 20s. They weren't real safe, so they didn't last a long time. In fact, they made guard shacks out of them around the mines here when they decommissioned them. Okay, you know, coming off the mob, and I was in the station department, so I worked from Laredo up to Chicago, and once in a while I'd mention the M&I, or the Mike and Ike, and there were a lot of MOPAC people who never heard of it. They heard of the Tex Pacific, they heard of the CNEI, but unless you routed cars, you know, over the M&I, they never saw it in the route. So I thought that was interesting. But anyway, you can see why. I mean, here's the whole MOPAC, and here's your M&I right there. Okay, why did they build the railroad? I mean, that's the first question. They don't build them for grins because they're expensive. As you guys know, the largest lead belt in the world is in southern Missouri. They started in the 1870s. Two major lead companies. Well, first of all, they were bringing the lead out by dirt road. So wintertime, rain and all that stuff, they'd get heavily rutted. So they really didn't have year-round transportation to get the lead out. So they built a 3-foot gauge so they could ship year-round from Bonterre over to Summit on the Iron Mountain. Later you had the backers of the Illinois Southern wanted to promote rail traffic coming up from the Mid-South to the east over St. Genevieve Kellogg Ferry, right into Chicago, and try to stay out of St. Louis yards. Because once you get in a major class yard, like in St. Louis, your rail car can spend 3, 4, 5 days sitting there trying to get out, just trying to get them from one train to another, get them across the river. So the big advertisement here was route it through the M&I and you get it into Chicago faster and move faster. There was the president, John Walsh, of the Southern Indiana. He owned a whole bunch of little small, medium-sized railroads. And he envisioned having farming products coming out of southern Missouri, traveling northeast markets, and then coal would come opposite direction because Missouri had poor coal deposits. And he was going to use this gateway through St. Genevieve on the car ferry. Then also, as you guys know, the line production saw the rise of the rail lines. The M&I was pretty unique. One of its predecessor companies was 3-foot gauge. You know, I don't know if you guys know, most of the railroads in the United States are 4 foot, 8.5. But 3-foot gauge is cheap to build. You know, the equipment's smaller, roadbed's smaller, you're not moving as much dirt around, rail's smaller, everything is condensed. So they built the 3-foot gauge starting out with. One of the few railroads in the Midwest operated a car ferry for 5 decades. They had the only switchback between the Alleghenies and the Rockies, and that's the, I'll look it up later, it's one of the branches out here. And in typical many short lines, the motor power fleet was all secondhand locomotives and rolling stock. They didn't buy a brand new locomotive until 1925. Well, here's kind of the family tree. So here's the St. Louis and Deloge, which was a 3-foot gauge they built over to Summit. And that turned into the MRBT. And they figured out they made their mistake pretty quick. So it was only 3-foot gauge for 2 years, and then they re-gauged it to 4 foot, 8.5. Over on the Illinois side, you have the Centralia and Chester, which was started off as a Sparta and St. Genevieve. You know, all these roads had little paper trailings to them so they could sell stocks and bonds. And then the Illinois Southern came about. These guys went bankrupt. And actually what was going to happen is they were going to take this apart and sell it for scrap. And the lead belt companies and the Mystic and Lime said, well, that's the only way we get to market. So that's how they started the Missouri, Illinois in 1921. They operated until 29, then the Mott bought it in 1929, and they merged with the Mott in 78. Okay, I may have already said all this. So, yeah, the St. Joe Lead, Deloge Company had a joint venture, built the St. Louis and Deloge Railway, 1880, 13-mile narrow gauge from Bonne Terre to Summit. Then they couldn't establish freight rates with the Iron Mountain, so you're over at Summit, they're shipping cars up into St. Louis, and all of a sudden the big railroad says we want more money, the little railroad says we don't want to pay it. So what they do is they build a BT completely bypassing the Iron Mountain to a car ferry at Riverside, and then they abandon the 13-mile route over to Summit. Well, here's Bonne Terre, here's Summit. Just give you an idea geographically. Here's Mineral Point. DeSoto's up here. Oh, I'm just interested. Look at their timetable. It took them 1 hour and 15 minutes to travel 13 miles. So they weren't exactly burning up the track. Here's some of the narrow gauge equipment. I don't know if you can tell how much smaller it is, but these engines were little bitty tea kettles, 3-foot gauge. This is over St. Joe Lead is in the background. So the MRVT, as I mentioned, they bypassed the Iron Mountain completely, which is over here. And they're going to Bonne Terre, up through Herculaneum, and this is where they put on the car ferry at Riverside. So in 1891, they had 32 miles track, 2 miles of siding, still 3-foot gauge, 65-pound rail, which meant every 3 feet of the rail was only 65 pounds. That's pretty small. It was probably about this high. It looked like probably the rail out at the zoo, St. Louis Zoo. 7 locomotives, a couple passenger cars, 10 freight cars. Not a very big outfit. After they standard gauged, they had 96 miles. They got it up to 4 foot 8.5. Put in some 75-pound rail. 19 locomotives, 6 passenger cars, Mail Express. All these dump cars, obviously, is for the iron ore. Okay. November 1st, 1883, they changed, converted over to standard gauge. Now, you know, it just wasn't taking the locomotives and the cars and bringing out the trucks and the wheels. You had to do all the track too, and all the switches and all the yards. I mean, this wasn't a small decision to make. But they couldn't interchange with the other railroads. You know, if you're 3-foot gauge and everybody else is 4 foot 8.5, they can't haul your cars for you. So that was the premise to standard gauge. Now, what happened when they built the standard gauge? They could have tighter curves, and so when they bought their standard gauge locomotives, they had to make sure some of the drivers on the center were blind, didn't have flanges on them, or they wouldn't go around the curves. Let's say this also gave them access to Union Station with tracker rights over the Iron Mountain, 27 miles. So they actually had an MRVT train going to Union Station, pick up passengers and depart. And being built as narrow gauge, 46% of the main line was curved, and one branch was 67% curved. Like I said, requiring standard steam engines to have blind center drivers. That's a lot of curves on a track. All right, come on. There's one of the engines coming out of Union Station. That'd be about pre-World War I. The master mechanic off the MR&BT got an award back then for having the cleanest locomotives in and out of Union Station. Which meant they're polishing all this stuff here, the bell, you know, everything on these locomotives were pristine. Well, let's see. This is at Riverside. You can see they're still running. Here's standard gauge, and here's narrow gauge. There's a narrow gauge locomotive. They're traveling on the same track. They both use the same depot, and they just split the cost up 50-50, which is pretty common for railroads back then in small towns. Here's the MR&BT yards. Here's the incline going up to the coaling station, and the shops are over here to the right. I always thought this was a great picture of the facilities. You can see how much angle they've got in these things so they can do a quick dump of the ore when they want to unload them. Okay, the Centurion Western was one of the lines that merged into the M&I. They had 65 miles of main line, 5 miles of branch lines. They were 4 foot 8.5, 65-pound rail. So that's how the M&I connected up with Salem. So you go down to Salem, down here to the river. There's some of their early rolling stock, 440s. They were first incorporated in Illinois December 7th, 1883. They went in receivership, only having completed rail in 5 counties. They sold it for closure to John Walsh, which is the guy I mentioned earlier, to extend his railroad from Terre Haute, Indiana, to the Mississippi, so it could connect with the western roads. So, here's the Illinois Southern. Here's Salem. Come down here to Sparta. We got there. Kellogg. And they had a car ferry across here. Then they went ahead and went up to Bismarck. They also had a little branch going down to Chester. And they're a land track on the Missouri side, $1.50 a day. Yeah.
They're still hiring at that rate.
You know, there were no machines. I mean, it was all shovel and hand dug. It was. Their steam shovel they used. Now, in the original picture, you can see this guy is on a separate track from the main line. So he's over here on a temporary track, and he's doing work to keep the main line clear. I had the opportunity, Linda Marler, who was a diesel supervisor for the M&I. I met Linda at a train show in St. Louis probably 35 years ago. And he'd come up to you and the first thing he'd say is, "You got any M&I pictures?" "Nope." He'd just walk off. And when he passed away, when I was going to do this book, and I amassed a collection of maybe 300 photographs. And I thought, well, I can do a book on the M&I. It won't be very big. So then Dennis Faircloth went to high school with Lindell's 2 sons. And he said, Lindell's got, he's since passed away from cancer, he's got 6 or 8 volumes of pictures on the M&I. And each volume was about this thick. And so, you know, I jumped from having about 300 pictures to about 3,000 pictures for this book. And I had a couple other guys sent me thumb drives with several hundred pictures in them too. You know, a lot of duplication, obviously, but there was a lot of unique stuff that I didn't have. So. There's a job. So they're building a bridge over Rough Creek, which is still there, obviously. They couldn't pay that.
That's along 32 then, right?
Yeah. So here's Kellogg, here's the incline for the boat. Came down, came back up, docked up against us. The Muir was a superintendent on the railroad. That's where they got their name. Originally it was called Little Rock. Well, I don't know if you know much about the Mopac, but there's a Little Rock in Arkansas. And after they bought the M&I, they couldn't stand to have two Little Rocks on the railroad. It just confused. You'd have rail cars from Little Rock going up here, and so they changed it. This is a neat picture. So here we are on the Missouri side. Here's the Frisco crossing, interlocking. Get back there. Here's Frisco coming across. Here you can see the car carriers in the background. There's a steam engine here on the incline. Here's their little yard over here. This all new there?
Yeah, that's Little Rock Way.
Yeah.
You guys still call it Little Rock?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think
But
the
those
street
buildings are
that
gone.
runs there is called Little Rock.
Well, we weren't allowed to call Little Rock on the mile, so this is the first ferry. Now called a ferry, but they didn't really have ferries when they started. They used them as tugboats. So this one was actually built down at Chester, and then they'd have a barge, and they'd put the rail cars in the barge and run back and forth. All right. Here's our second ferry. Was the St. Genevieve, built in 1902. It was all wood. As I was reading through newspaper reports, it was painted black and white. So I don't know what the hell you did. You're on a boat in the middle of the night trying to see it. And here's a passenger car on here, and then it's got, I think it had 2 tracks. Yeah. This is your incline car. They couldn't let the weight of the locomotive get on the boat. You know, it's just too heavy. So they'd have a idler car or a incline car. That's what this is. They just took a flat car and put a doghouse on the back of it for the crew. That's probably about pre-World War I. Here he is trapped in the ice in 1912. Okay. So March 1st, 1918, the St. Genevieve was docked at Kellogg and hit the pilings with such a force the wood hull was split open, sinking with a full load of cars. That did it in, obviously. And Lindell even had pictures. Here's the guys on the boat salvaging what they can, which I just thought was amazing. So the bell for this thing is in the Catholic cemetery here in town. Supposedly, unless somebody stole it.
That's for a wood boat, Charlie?
Yeah. There's a builder's photo. And builder's photos, they used to put all this little pinstriping on them. You know, all the little stuff around the tires. They didn't do that on the production. You just got a plain Jane locomotive that's painted black. There's a new one. Second St. Genevieve was steel hull, ordered by the M&I, placed in service in 1922. You can still see MR and BT reported marks on the cars. So, Dennis, who was the guy we interviewed that was a deckhand? That's all right. I got him in the book.
Don Call.
Okay. So we went and interviewed Don Crow. Don worked on the boat, and we'd show him different pictures, and he would explain the whole thing, how they switched. Had a device, once they got this track hooked up to one of these pieces here, they dropped a pin down, and he called that the bull moose. Here's another shot from the pilot house. Here's the incline where we're going to couple up to it. There it is. So here's the pin. He called this the bull moose. Once this track got butted up against it, they dropped it down in there, and that's how they would stay split apart. And I gotta get a guy's name. There was a post-dispatch photographer who was a rail fan. He came down, Wayne Lehman. So Wayne was a huge rail fan, lived in Webster Groves, talked himself into riding. In the other book I got here, I've got a lot of his photographs where he's riding transfer runs across from Dupont to St. Louis and down to Sykeston. But he came down here for a week and rode with the crew unloading rail cars and stuff. So a lot of his pictures are in the book. And, typical newspaper guy, they're just a lot of pictures of the people too. He's got shots of the guy shoveling coal down in the coal bunker, the captain up in the wheelhouse. There's one of the consolidations and another type of idler car that they used. So the signal, if you remember, I mentioned the Frisco crossing the M&I in an earlier picture. That signals keep them, let them know that Frisco is either clear or they've got to stop and wait for the Frisco to go by. Here's a shot from the idler car looking on one of the ferries. Interesting, they got one of the diesels on here. Probably going for maintenance over to the shops. The M&I dieselized in 1949, which is pretty early for a railroad. And they just had Alcos. They had one EMD they tried, but they mostly went with the Alco RS3s. There's a picture of the incline. Roads on rails, so as the river goes up and down, this thing can stay with it. Of course, you got a dike here in case the river really comes up. You can get all your freight cars out of the yard and close this off. This is the boat yard. Okay. So, like I mentioned earlier, the Illinois Southern was pretty run down when the M&I got it. And at the foreclosure proceedings, one of the bondholders wanted to bid the scrap value of the road for $725,000. He was going to dismantle it. So that's when your line producers and your lead producers woke up and said, we're going to give you $900,000. We're going to operate it for 10 years. So they incorporated under the laws of Missouri 1921, and then the MOP got them in 1929. So here's what the M&I looks like. So you're going from little branches down here, Turpin and Mill Run Junction, Flat River. So it's all farmer MRBT property, and then this is all farmer Illinois Southern. They had a mine down here, and a mine down here. And they had converted box cars with seats in them, and they'd haul the miners out to the mine site. That was their passenger service. So industries, and one thing I did about the book, I got enough information. When you got a railroad, the only reason it's there is because of the industry. So I wrote the book in station order, and I wanted to make pictures of the industries in those chapters as well. So So the railroad served the largest lead deposit in the world, large limestone operations around St. Genevieve. On the Missouri side was pretty poor. They're shipping out forest products, ties, poles, mining cocks. Illinois had a small grain elevator and mills, 3 coal mines, rail business at Centralia, Sparta, and Salem, getting interchange with the other roads. And then they discovered a big oil field near Salem. Oil was discovered in 1937 at Selmaville, and by 1939, 93 million barrels of oil were being pumped from Marion County farmland. And I was told this is what really brought the M&I into the black, was discovering this. Here's one of the mines and all the guys. I also wrote a lot of historical societies. You know, it's great on the web nowadays, as much crap is out there, but you can, do a search for a county with a historical society, get a hold of the librarian, say, do you have any pictures? I'm writing a book. And they'll scan stuff in for you and send it to you, just give them credit for it. So that helps, and then, they get a book out of the deal. There's a picture of the Mississippi line back in the old days. Dennis, did you say what year you thought this was?
I forget what that was. That was before 78. It was early in the 70s, late 60s. Yeah.
Here's St. Joe Lead. Here's the Mississippi in the background. This all looks like a golf course today, doesn't it? Anybody know what that is?
No.
I actually went up to the Missouri Mining Museum because I had all these pictures and they weren't labeled. And I sat down with one of the young guys there, and he helped me with labeling all the correct mines around. A guy from Omaha, St. Louis isn't going to know that stuff. But there's actually a mine shaft right behind that CNI boxcar. Here's where the museum is, by the way. St. Joe Lead at Bonne Terre. Federal Mill near Flat River. Obviously, they're taking us off of Chat Hill. Well, you're talking about some little box cars. Today we're looking at 50 foot and 60 foot, and these guys were 36 foot at best. So here's the R&BT, and then here's some Italian. And M&I had a lot of these 40-foot steel box cars they ordered back in the late 30s. Here's where they loaded the lead concentrate. And so they could dump out quickly, obviously. Look at the inside with the slopes they put inside them. There's a bobber caboose. You know what? It looked like they just went through the catalog and took every variation caboose they could find. These were outlawed later because they didn't have end steps on them. You're trying to get onto this. If you don't make that step, you're going to go into the wheels. More. There's a coal chute at Bonne Terre. Obviously the caboose track. Here's a scale house. If you're going to weigh cars coming out, you want to know what you're going to charge a shipper for the weight of the lading. So you had to weigh every single load coming out of here. So they didn't have full-fledged passenger trains. I mean, they had a few, but this was their most common way of getting passengers around. So this is what they call the gas electric. So they had a gasoline engine, electric to the trucks, just like a diesel electric. This was a RPO baggage, so they actually had a railway post office inside here and the baggage here. So they could sort mail en route. Here's where they got their first diesels. So the negative on this thing, because I was able to borrow it, is there's a guy standing off over here to the side, two guys, with flashes standing up like this. That's how they illuminated all this stuff. East end of the road was Salem, within a two-stall concrete engine house. Here's the gas electric. That's never a good day.
There was no will.
Yeah. Right on Illinois Southern Evansville Hill.
That's where I lived, that was on.
I bet there's still some of these pieces laying around now. This is a bad wreck. The M&I ran over the IC at Branch Junction just a little bit. And the IC ran by a stop and ran into the M&I and killed the crew. Oh, this was interesting. So he was going to go over, let's see, southbound local on a Sunday, so you got a nice slow Sunday to go to work, no problems. At 4:35, they came to this washout at Albright's Curve. 65 feet long, 12 feet deep, caused by 7 inches of rain that put the big river out of its banks. Somebody was telling me that it was, when they were working down here, they'd hear a creak or a pop, and everybody just go running, as you can imagine.
That's familiar.
Does it? So what happened here is the pilings got washed too much, and the minute the way the locomotives hit it, that's what collapsed the bridge.
You just gone over it earlier with Logan.
1970.
And this one, the kid threw a switch on stub track at Von Terre, and nobody was hurt, but obviously got a caboose up in the air. Because of the snow, the police could just follow the tracks of the kid back to his house.
Not the sharpest drive, not the sharpest knife in the drawer.
Okay, the end of the ferry and alternative routing. So, as you can imagine, there's problems with car ferries. You know, by 1961, the machinery was 40 years old. It was too costly to repair. And it was idle during the low water in the Mississippi. So, I went through, it was down for 22 days this year, 17 days, 55 days. Here you got 95 days in 1956, which is a hell of a way if you're a railroad and you're trying to advertise transit time and being on time. This doesn't work for you too well. So, plus the hull itself was getting thin, and I think the Corps of Engineers was going to condemn it anyway. And Jinx had come on the property, and he wasn't too thrilled with the car ferry. So, when the ferry was out of service, I don't want to bore you with all this stuff, but so the M&I would come down to the Mop and come up this way to East St. Louis. Or they'd come this way and come up that way to East St. Louis, or St. Louis proper on this side. So they had some wiggle room to get out either side, even though they don't have a car ferry anymore. Then, hey, don't do that. 65, they went over and they came down the Mop to Thebes, ran across Thebes Bridge, and came up this way over to Frisco, and then got back on the M&I. There's your Thebes Bridge. Okay. Basically the same thing, coming down on the M&I, coming up on the mop here. Here they kind of wiggled around, didn't use the Frisco as much. Came around this way, over on the mop. They made it bi-directional is what they did. Here's some color shots in the book. M&I Local 466 near Salem, and they had Frisco running off of mileage equalization. So railroads would let each other use their locomotives, like on run-through trains. Well, when you do that, you accumulate mileage that you owe the other railroad. So you've got to lend them locomotives, they lend you locomotives, so they equal it out. So that's what that Frisco engine's using, is being used in the consists. We're down at switching the power plant. Okay, and they were merged with the MOP in November 2nd, 1978, 55 years of service under the subsidiary name. So if you think about it, and I was in the station department, when you had a CNEI and a Texas Pacific and an M&I and a DKNS and all these other little roads, they all kept separate books. And like down at Texarkana, for example, when the MOPAC and the TP shared the same yard, you had to do internal interchange. It was just a lot of rework on the inside. So that's why the M&I went away with all these other roads to simplify all the accounting. So I just took some images from the book and just tossed them in towards the last part of it. Well, it's just a nice shot. Everybody's got their family out there. This is inside the Bonterra Depot. There's Herculaneum. Yeah, the Leadwood branch is the one that had the switchback on it with all the 67% curves. Here's one of the shots the newspaper guy took while he was on the boat. You can see the diesels on the incline. So the little gas electric broke down around Flinton, and they called the MOPAC up and they put a steam engine on it, completed to run. They borrowed a EMD switcher from the MOP in the late 30s, and so they did order one for switching in St. Genevieve. Engineers back then dressed, after they got their diesels, they dressed really nice. Got all in white overalls. They are in Bonterra engine house. Here's Bismarck. I'll show you a yard. This is the scale track over here, what Dennis told me. It's a repeat. That was typical power at the roundhouse here, or Little Rock. Railroad water train at Nashville. Now this is well after the M&I went away, and you notice the crew stuck on here chalk M&I.
Good
Here's
focus,
a break. My last one. Any questions?
Can we see a show of hands of everybody in here that's worked on the railroad? How many of you worked on the M&I railroad?
How many showed up for work?
Just Dennis up there in that photo. when they loaded, how many of you worked when they switched on the transfer boat? Anybody?
I worked with a guy that worked on the boat for 73.
Baldwin did it, is he here?
No.
He was in the museum a few weeks ago, and he worked the last year and a half that the transfer boat was in operation, and told us some things about it.
He's the one that got the video on YouTube, isn't it? Yeah.
What's his name? Art Baldwin, but they call him Porky.
Well, Tony Kuhn was the last engineer that worked the transfer boat when he spotted. The day they pulled the transfer boat off, he retired. That was the last day he worked on the railroad.
When they loaded the transfer boat, and you had one with the locomotive in it, that would have been the heaviest thing they were loading, would it not been? They loaded it in the center track, and you would load that first, the way I understand it, right? Whatever the heaviest load you were going to have, you put on the center track to balance the boat out, so that when you backed in the other sides, it was balanced out.
How many cars did it hold?
18 40-foot.
Were there any other transfer facilities similar to this?
Yeah, a few of the railroads, the MOP actually had one down at New Orleans. In Natchez, they had one. I know they had one up at St. Louis at Crondolets. They had 4 car ferries. Ellen had a couple. The Illinois Central had a couple.
That one at Natchez was still there. I worked out of Pine Bluff, that was in 95, 96.
Was it?
I think that transfer, the St. John transfer went to Natchez. When they got shut it down up here, they took it down south, and I'm pretty sure that's where it ended up at.
Barge out of it.
Just the barge,
Yeah.
just the barge.
Down at Natchez.
Right.
So, if you have one of Charlie's books, Charlie will sign it for you? Am I
Oh, yeah.
correct?
Yeah.
So Charlie will sign your book. You want to talk a little bit about your third book?
Yeah, I was telling somebody, I asked if they'd read this one, and they said, no, we looked at the pictures. So I wrote another book based on what I thought was about 300-400 best pictures of the Mopac. And it's all over the system. There's some M&I in here, but this is Little Rock, for example. Here's the road to St. Louis. I've got steam, diesel. Here's the, this was interesting, just tell you what you can do nowadays. This is the telegrapher down at Sykeston. And 2 guys I knew, Jerry Lassiter, Jerry hired out to Sykeston, and Norm Shacklet did too. They didn't know who he was, or they were arguing back and forth on who he was. Finally, we found a seniority roster from Dennis Faircloth, and we picked out who the guy's proper name was. But in going through all this, well, he had other, this is, again, the photographer that went down, you know, all these pictures of the crews switching the facility. There's a crew caller in St. Louis, just to show you how complicated crew calling was back then. This is the operator in Kirkwood, copying train orders. But anyway, I think we're going to have those through the museum. So this is a fun book to write. I mean, the guy took great photographs. They're all over the system, from Laredo up to St. Louis, out to Kansas City, Poplar Bluff, White River.
So Charlie could have sent us a case, and we'll sell them out at the museum down here for anybody that wants them. What, about a week, Charlie, you think, or something?
Well, we got to get hold of it. Yeah, we'll work on that.
Okay.
So I'll sit down and sign books until my hand falls off.
So, Charlie, you didn't mention it, but the Missouri, Illinois, after they pulled the transfer boat off, Sparta was a terminal, St. Genevieve was a terminal. The farthest distance they had to travel to get through to both terminals for the shortest distance, Sparta and St. Genevieve, was 20-something miles apart. We ran 131 miles to get from St. Genevieve to Sparta, going up to St. Louis. And it was the longest distance any train in the country traveled to get between two terminals that close together.
Wow.
Yeah. And the two steepest inclines on the Missouri Pacific in this part of Missouri, and maybe all the way in Missouri, one was at Bonne Terre, coming from the depot, going south. That was the steepest, and the other one was at Evansville, Illinois. And if you didn't hit the bottom of Evansville at 40 miles an hour, you weren't going to make it if you was running tonnage at all.
At 41, you ended up with
Yeah.
that steam.
That's what happens.
Evansville Hill.
Evansville Hill.
So the track is still intact from St. Genevieve all the way to Bonne Terre, is that correct?
Right. You can still go out there, and then when you get to Elvins or Derby Junction, then you would take off and you would head toward Bonne Terre. And Kenny, my brother, actually worked the work trains that tore the track out between Bonne Terre and Platten. And he worked that when he first hired out. He worked them work trains.
We were the last train to leave out of Bonne Terre going north. When we come back, there was no track behind us.
Right. I ran the last train that come from Sparta into St. Genevieve back in 1980. And they pulled
But
that
the track stays in place because Mississippi Line leased the line, is that right?
Right.
They have a lease on that line? That's what's keeping the track in place, and it hasn't been.
It's their only route out with rail traffic once if the river floods. That's their only way out. And they go from there to Bismarck, and they interchange at Bismarck, go back on to Mopac and stuff.
So the line isn't that good anymore? It's, what's it got, about is it a 12 mile per hour? 10 mile per hour speed limit and 19 car limit.
Right.
So they still use the track when it floods. That's Mississippi's line waiting move line. And one train car holds how many tractor trailers? 4? Yeah. Takes 4 tractor trailers to make one train car. So it's very vital that Mississippi Line maintains that line.
See, when it used to flood, the trains would go from here to Bismarck. One crew would take it to Bismarck. From Bismarck, they'd run around their train, take it to St. Louis, go across into the A&S yards, and they would run down to, was it the CNI? You run down to CNI to Kohlerville, and then from Kohlerville, you'd go into Sparta. Is how they used it.
I see.
Oh, yeah, the IC.
Illinois Central.
The Illinois Central. Yeah, you'd run down that way.
What speed did they go across Rough Creek Trestle now?
It's still 10 miles an hour. And it's the best piece of track between here and Bismarck. That's that. But we had an engineer when we first hired out, Phil Leidman. His dad was the engineer. There was 2 Phils, but old man Phil was the engineer running the work train when they were setting the metal out in Rough Creek Bridge.
He actually brought the first steam engine from Illinois across the transfer boat and at Tommy or Little Rock.
Yeah.
I think that bridge was built in 1902. There was a newspaper article that said they had just got to it.
If you ever see, also, if you ever watched the movie In the Heat of the Night, that was filmed in Sparta, and there is a clip in that thing where they're chasing after them and they're going underneath the MI railroad tracks, and there's a switch crew working up there, and Kenny was working.
I was on the crew.
Yeah.
In fact, we went into the roundhouse and we moved cars around, and the film crew would come in and they were chasing Sidney Poitier around, and then they'd have us change the position of the cars, and they'd come in and do another shoot, and he'd run the other way through there.
So if you want to get Ken's signature, he said.
Yeah. But I do have one thing I'd like to add to this. And I don't know what year it was, but Bob Frimmel was the train master down here at St. Genevieve. And the railroad come out and they give all the employees belt buckles. And it had MP, TP, M&I, C and I on all 4 corners.
Right.
And I was local chairman. I got to look at the books down there. Bob Frimmel showed them to me. We were the smallest railroad, but we had more net income. The TP was in big trouble. We had more net income than the TP, which was way bigger, and more net income than the CNEI, which was way bigger. Our little 126-mile railroad.
Probably one of the richest railroads in the country per mile, per tonnage mile, was the MI. For 126 miles or whatever it was, we had more revenue than most any railroad around. Simply because of Doe Run Lead, Mississippi Line, the coal mines, the oil fields. And at the time, we had quite a bit of grain business between Sparta and Salem. There was several pretty big elevators. We'd get anywhere to 20 cars a day sometimes out of them grain elevators up there when harvest season hit.
When that oil boom hit up at Selma,
Right.
when I hired out in the railroad, we still were doing a lot of rail cars of oil.
Is Mississippi Line still the largest shipper?
They were when I retired. When I retired, they were still the largest shipper on the Missouri, on the Union Pacific. They were still the largest when I retired.
At one time, back in the, I'm gonna guess the 70s or 80s, Mississippi Line was shipping about 80 cars a day, and they was shipping more by truck than they was by rail. And that's
Now they do, but not in the 70s. In the 70s, yet, we were taking Mississippi Line by rail. We would leave 6 nights a week with no less than 75 cars. And on Sunday night, usually you was 140 to 175 cars on Sunday night you'd leave St. Genevieve with. And it wasn't until in the 80s before the truck industry started taking over more business at Mississippi Line. But throughout the 70s, and that's, well, Kenny hired out in the mid-60s, and I hired out in 70. But we handled most of the business, probably, 70% of the business at Mississippi Line, until the mid-80s, I'd say. When they pulled the jobs off and we went to Sparta, that's when we started losing business to the trucking industry.
I'll take a lot of trucks and 175 rail cars at 4 trucks per rail car.
And I think it was, when did Mississippi Line go on strike? 73?
73.
Okay, I worked second switcher, the night job, the day that they come off strike, and we took 102 cars that night and spotted them in Mississippi Line.
Right.
102 cars we took in one night out there and spotted.
When they first started running up to St. Louis to Sparta, they actually built a track up in St. Louis just for the MI trains, so they could pull up there and get them out of the way so they could run their heavy freight trains that was going to Kansas City and stuff.
The compress.
The compress track was built specifically for the Missouri, Illinois, and that's when we ran up through Carondelet Park. And then they changed where we'd run up along the river. We ran right behind Anheuser-Busch and went up on MacArthur Bridge that way. There's a lot of stories can't tell. They're a lot more fun too.
I know I could tell some more sport.
Yeah.
What kind of stories would he have?
There's a few. Rich Helms was with me one time, and we can't talk about that one too much.
Thank you all for coming. Hope you enjoyed it. Again, we'll have a lot of other presentations. Please watch the website.